Thank you everyone who is attending the CRWDP New Researcher webinar for April. We have as a panelist Sabrina Hossain, and Sabrina is a master's student at McMaster School of Rehabilitation Science and a student fellow with the CRWDP. Sabrina's interests are in work disability policy, workplace wellness, and workplace accommodation practices. Her professional experience lies in the field of disability and claims management. Today, Sabrina will be discussing the findings from her master's thesis work in the form of two qualitative papers, one exploring how workplace accommodations are negotiated for employees with mental illness, and the second discussing the dimensions of social capital that impact the negotiation process. Her aim with this research and in the future is to shed light on how employees can be better supported in their work roles through improved workplace policies, practices, and accessibility resources. Just before I hand this over to Sabrina, I wanted to remind everyone that we have a Q&A session after Sabrina's presentation, which will last anywhere between 30 and 40 minutes. So I'm going to now hand it over to Sabrina, who will take us through her findings.
Okay, thank you so much, Pam. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here as I talk about my research. So my name is Sabrina, and I am currently finishing my master's in rehabilitation science at McMaster University. So I will be discussing my thesis research around negotiating workplace accommodations, as Pam said, for employees with mental health conditions. However, just for the sake of time, I will only be discussing my first paper, not both of the papers. So just really quickly, I should say that this research was done in collaboration with and with the guidance from my supervisor, Dr. Rebecca Gewirtz, and my committee members, Dr. Sandra Moll and Dr. Emil Chompa, and also with the support and funding from the CRWDP. So just really briefly, some background on myself. So my research interests are in work disability policy and accommodation practices, specifically for employees with mental health conditions. I am also really interested in workplace cultural factors and how those influence, day-to-day work practices. So just starting with a brief agenda. So I will start by just providing some brief background information and literature, some key definitions, and then presenting my research question. And then I'll move on to talk about my methodology and my findings, and then finish off briefly with, some potential future directions for this program of research. So workplace accommodations have really been shown to be, in the literature and also in practice, to be a really important way of supporting employees with mental health conditions. Accommodations are defined as individualized modifications implemented to enable an employee with mental illness to fulfill the requirements of their job. So the reason that it is really important right now in today's work context to draw attention to accommodation practices, specifically for mental health conditions, is that mental illness related disability claims are currently a pretty big deal. They're a significant burden right now in Canadian workplaces. They are very costly. They can costing billions of dollars in low productivity and absenteeism, and often lower employee retention. In fact, the situation is quite serious. The World Health Organization reported that mental illness will become the second largest, cause of global disease in the next century. And they did mandate that, governments and businesses and organizations should really be investing more human and financial capital into the policies and programs to support individuals, employees with mental health conditions. So, there are some changes, some great changes happening in workplaces right now in policy and practice, and also in workplace education with regards to mental health and psychological safety, such as the National Standard of Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace that came out in 2013. We've got the 13 factors of psychological health and safety in the workplaces, and things like resources like mental health first aid training, which are being slowly offered in more and more workplaces. However, I will say that these are, they're newer tools. They're still being introduced in workplaces, and there are definitely a lot of workplaces that these resources have not trickled down into yet, and that does leave a lot of employees vulnerable. And so the literature supports that, and the literature says that yes, more stakeholders are becoming aware of tools and guidelines to support employees with mental health conditions. And stakeholders are trying to implement them more in Canadian workplaces. However, when asked, the stakeholders did say that generally they are still more hesitant about the impact and usefulness of those tools, just because there is still a lack of employer education and understanding of exactly how to implement these kinds of resources successfully. So the literature does show that accommodating employees with a mental health condition or a mental illness is an interactive negotiation process. It requires participation from the employee, from their manager or supervisor, and also other workplace stakeholders. And that can be union representatives, it can be disability case managers, return to work coordinators, what have you. So, but what I really wanted to explore for my thesis work is what happens during that negotiation process, and really make it more transparent. There is really a gap in understanding and quite limited literature of how that negotiation process unfolds. What are the kind of mini processes that are happening? What are the factors that are coming into play, and what are the tensions that come up? Who is involved? So that brought me to my first paper, which is called The Interactive Process of Negotiating Workplace Accommodations for Employees with a Mental Illness. So my research question here is, how are workplace accommodations negotiated between employees with a mental health condition and workplace stakeholders? I find this to be really important research right now, just as I said, given the current burdens of mental illness-related disability claims. Employers need to become more aware and more progressive about supporting workers. So my hope is really that this research can contribute to findings that really encourage organizations somehow to become more, competent at supporting its members, and really foster and create more progressive and inclusive workplaces. So I will talk briefly about methodology, just really briefly, and if anyone has any questions about it, I will be really happy to talk about it more in detail during the question and answer. So I used a qualitative approach. Qualitative research really incorporates, it can incorporate many flexible ways to describe, analyze, and interpret social processes. And I also use strategies of a grounded theory approach specifically in my data collection and my analysis. So the reason I use grounded theory is because grounded theory provides really great flexible strategies to analyze processes about which we might not know a lot, and help us generate conceptual statements or build theories about how actors are interpreting those processes. Okay, so if negotiating accommodations is this social process, I felt that grounded theory was a really good fit, or techniques of grounded theory was a good fit. So grounded theory techniques were used to generate an understanding of how workplace accommodations are negotiated from the perspective of the actors that are engaged in that process. So just briefly moving into data collection. Again, I'm really happy to talk about this more in detail if anyone has questions. I had basically 2 rounds of recruitment. So at first I used a more initial propulsive sampling strategy to capture as many diverse perspectives as I could. So I was just really looking to talk to any adults between the ages of 18 and 60 years old who were employed or recently employed in the last 3 years in Canadian workplaces, either as employees with a self-proclaimed mental health condition who had experienced requesting and negotiating accommodations, or stakeholders who had experience in negotiating and implementing accommodations specifically for workers with a mental health condition. So that was my first round of recruitment. And my second round of recruitment, I did a more focused theoretical sampling strategy, which is a grounded theory approach to data collection. And again, I can talk about that more if anyone has any questions. So really briefly about my participants, I had 12 study participants in the end. So 6 workers who had experience requesting and or negotiating accommodations, be it successfully or unsuccessfully, and 6 stakeholders. And my stakeholders that I had recruited were managers, they were disability management professionals, human resources professionals, occupational health and safety nurses, and I'm happy to share more demographic info or demographic table on the participants if anyone is curious. So I did conduct individual phone interviews with each of the participants using a semi-structured interview guide that I further developed iteratively the further in I got with the data collection. So I asked participants to share their experience and their insights about how negotiating accommodations unfolded. And again, if anyone is interested in seeing the interview questions, I'm also happy to share. So the data that I collected verbatim from these interviews was analyzed using qualitative grounded theory strategies. And my goal with the analysis was really to build not necessarily a theory, but a theoretical understanding and identify the themes involved of the workplace negotiation process from the perspectives of the key stakeholders. Okay, so moving right into my findings. Now, what I really found is that the negotiation process often unfolds in a couple different ways. Firstly, it's often nonlinear and dynamic. It's a combination of smaller formal and informal miniature microprocesses and tensions. The negotiation process is also a social and relational process, and it's also a lot of times a political process. Additionally, there are some important workplace forces acting on the negotiation process, such as employer capacity or organizational capacity, stigma and discrimination, and also psychological health and safety in the workplace. So, while there may be an assumption and an overarching assumption of the accommodation process following a really chronological, time-sensitive formal process with really clear steps, the data actually reflected and employees and stakeholders reported that it was often a lot more flexible than that. And usually the process was a combination of smaller micro processes that were, formal and informal, and that made up a larger process. So here is a quote that kind of exemplifies what that means. So this quote is from a disability manager, and Kate, and she said, the process depends on the manager, it depends on the employee, it depends on if it's a good employee or not. So it's quite formal, but I do have managers who make informal arrangements, which is totally fine with us. The difficulty is if the manager makes an informal arrangement that goes on for a long period of time, and then the manager's like, why am I doing this? And then she kind of talks about the benefits of having a more formalized accommodation strategy. Okay, so as she's mentioning here, there are a lot of different factors that can shape what the negotiation process looks like. So it can definitely be nonlinear, and it is also flexible. So the negotiation process is also a social and interactive process. It does unfold with collaboration and communicating and cooperation between all the stakeholders involved. So another key finding that came from my research is, who were the stakeholders that are typically involved in negotiating accommodations, and it came up that actually there is sort of 2 tiers of stakeholders. There are more internal stakeholders and more external stakeholders, in addition to the primary stakeholder, who is the employee who requires support. So internal stakeholders were found to be the stakeholders that work directly with the worker in their workplace to discuss and negotiate and then implement the accommodations. And external stakeholders might be slightly less involved in the employee's workplace, and they really assisted the internal stakeholders in guiding the accommodation process, or they provided various kinds of support to the employee during the process. And I have here a stakeholder map that reflects that. And if you visualize it, it's kind of one small circle in the middle, and within the small circle you have the primary stakeholder, which is the worker with the mental health condition who requires the accommodation. Then outside of that smaller circle, we have a slightly larger circle, and that is the internal stakeholder. So that can be a manager or a direct supervisor. It can be the occupational health and safety department if that exists, union representatives, disability management coordinators, and the senior and departmental management. And then there is a third outside circle, which is the external stakeholders, and that can be family members. It's definitely health providers, third-party disability management or disability insurance providers, EAP service, and religious advisors. So one important tension that arose from my data is that, while negotiating accommodations, that cooperation and collaboration that I talked about are not always in equal measure. There is definitely not always a perfect give and take or back and forth. There was an implicit understanding among some of the workers that I spoke with that the process actually requires more cooperation from the worker, or that there was a lot of onus for the workers to just quietly follow their workplace policies that, that are required, and quietly follow the required steps to get that medical evidence, to submit it on time, to do X, Y, Z, because, and because they might be experiencing that process for the first time, workers weren't even always sure what their rights were, so there was almost a fear of an implicit feeling of, okay, if I behave and follow the rules and meet all the deadlines and do this, I will hopefully get my accommodation request granted. Okay, so definitely less about collaboration. And that can be really problematic because, the workers did report that, they often expected a more collaborative, guided experience. And so when they felt that this negotiation was not reciprocal and their needs were not being heard, that can be quite distressful. An example of that comes from this participant, Wendy, who she talks about being really disappointed and frustrating that negotiating accommodations was not like a mutual cooperative process with her health and safety coordinator. And also she didn't really receive guidance throughout the process the way she needed. So she says, I absolutely understand it as a two-way system, right? Me providing what I need as a worker, and from her insight to give feedback in terms of what she's also found. So that decision never happened. It was more so, hi, how are you feeling? Here are the things that I would like. We're done working on your accommodations. It just feels like I was given the short end of the straw because, once again, I've not experienced this before. So now, negotiating accommodations is also a relational process. The worker and the internal stakeholders needed to be able to relate to each other and mutually fulfill their roles for a smooth process. Workers reported that they felt more supported during negotiating accommodations when their internal stakeholders, specifically their direct supervisor or manager, dedicated time to supporting them, invested in them as an employee and saw their value, and also showed empathy and understanding of their needs. So a really good quote that exemplifies that comes from Julie, who is an employee, and she describes her positive experience with regards to accommodations with the manager who really valued her and showed her that. So she says, I had a manager who was trained, who understood, and who was compassionate. And she was willing to put in the blood and the tears to work with me to get me back because she saw the value in the work that I did. And in really strong comparison to that, workers reported that when they did not feel supported during the accommodation process, it was very distressing not to have someone committed and experienced guiding them, on top of the struggles that they were already having in their work. And here is a quote that exemplifies that. So again, here is Wendy talking about that health and safety coordinator who she had frustrations about. And here she's talking about how she had to be the one to educate her health and safety coordinator about the different treatments she was undergoing to provide the evidence that she was receiving treatment. Whereas it was expected for her that the health and safety coordinator should already be an expert on those. So she felt like she had to go through the process alone. Okay, so finally, so the negotiation process is also a political process. So the capacity to access accommodations varied across employees. It wasn't always the same, it wasn't always equal. And the capacity to access accommodations could depend on the work sector. So some accommodations obviously might be feasible in one work environment, but definitely not in another, but also other political influences, such as the worker's job position, their status, at their workplace and their seniority within the organization. And so something really interesting is that there was a really underlying implicit understanding reported by some of the part-time, contract, and seasonal employees that I spoke with, that everyone was definitely not treated the same regarding accommodations. There was a disparity in accessing accommodations between those workers, those more precarious workers, versus the more full-time, senior, permanent employees. This is a really important tension that arose in the data. I did focus my second paper more on this subject, so I won't go into too much detail here, but some of the workers did report sensing that that difference in access reflected to them how their organization valued some employees more than others. And, they told me that maybe their workplace felt it was just a better return on investment to negotiate and plan accommodations for some employees more than others. That being said, I did get feedback from a number of stakeholders who denied that any kind of preferential treatment would ever be given. However, they did also say that for workers who were more precarious and also had problematic behavior or problematic performance, who then required accommodation, they wouldn't be denied that accommodation on that basis, but perhaps there would definitely be maybe a bit more negative discourse around the process. So here are some examples of that underlying disparity that I was talking about. So here's Wendy, who is a part-time temporary worker, and she's talking about just a challenge in getting just a light changed at her workspace because she's not a full-time employee. So she says, if I were a permanent staff member, I wouldn't have had to wait a month to have the light taken off. I felt that because I wasn't a full-time staff member, she wasn't sure if I could actually even have those lights turned off in that specific area. So here, what she's really saying is that the stakeholder that she came to for accommodation didn't even really know what the workplace policy mandated about providing this kind of accommodation to someone who is not a full-time permanent employee. And also we have Caitlin, who is a seasonal, more precarious employee, describe that hierarchy of access to universal accommodations at work. And she describes it like a ladder. So she says, the lower down the rung you get, the less ability you have to access those resources that you need. They only reserve those types of resources for people who are there permanently, and we all know that. Okay, so now there are a number of workplace factors that did arise and were reported to impact how employees with a mental health condition experienced the negotiation process, what they find helpful and what was also challenging. So psychological health and safety in the workplace was reported as quite helpful by both workers and stakeholders. So in workplaces that were more inclusive, where employees felt secure in their job, if they ever disclosed their mental illness and their need for accommodations, in those kinds of workplaces, workers reported that they would be more likely to talk openly about their accommodation needs and openly make requests for an accommodation without fear. Okay, so here we have Elizabeth, who's a workplace manager, who talks about this, and she says, if you have a culture that's supportive of inclusion and fairness and actually talks openly about accommodation, that can be very helpful. So that sentiment was reflected by both workers and stakeholders. And also, another thing that was described as helpful was having established clear accommodation policies and practices that are accessible to both workers and stakeholders. And the reason that would be reported as helpful is so workers would know what they can realistically request or expect and what their rights are during the accommodation process, what their responsibilities are. And at the same time, stakeholders will also have a clear understanding of what their responsibilities are too. Many of the workers that I spoke with reported that often they didn't even know what their workplace disability or accommodation practices were. And that was reported to be a very significant stressor for them. Now, here are some quotes reflecting what some workers had to say. So Wendy said, they should have some sort of proper manual. There's nothing in particular about how specific things can be requested. And I have Ariel here, who is an employee at a large hospital. And she said, I'm already going through enough stuff if I'm asking for accommodation. The last thing I want to do is go and look at the small print of our collective agreement. Okay, so some of the things that were discussed as key challenges from the perspective of managerial staff. And some of the things that were described as key challenges were stigma and discomfort just around discussing mental illness from managerial staff and coworkers. So that was a key challenge reported both by employees and stakeholders who said that would make negotiating accommodations quite challenging. And some participants did say that they found that in their workplace, coworkers and managers didn't talk about mental illness at all because it felt too personal to them to be discussing it. But as a result, that's quite problematic because some workers reported that they were afraid of disclosing their need for accommodation, and instead they disguised their needs for support for a mental health condition into something that looked more acceptable. For example, taking sick days on the days that they actually really needed to go to the hospital. Or other times they just didn't say anything. They struggled in silence, which is really a big problem. And here's an example of that. We have Caitlin, who is a former part-time employee, and describing, her struggle to hide her mental health condition at work at times where she really needed the support. So she says, it was me disguising what was going on. Like, for instance, I had a relative who died, and I couldn't go to my boss and say, hey, I've gotten lost in the deep end. I've gone a little psychotic here, and it's kind of a really hard week. And she also says, because people still look at it as crazy, and crazy is something that these people don't want to work with. So another final challenge here is that there is definitely a negative discourse around supporting employees with mental illness. It's still definitely more ambiguous, and the literature reflects that as well, in comparison to a more normalized discourse around accommodating physical disabilities in the workplace. And Samantha, who is a disability manager, talked about seeing this constantly in her line of work. And she said, it's really a discomfort, but we don't have it with a broken leg. Why do we have it with a broken mind? But people do. And one other challenge that arose as really important from the perspective of workers and stakeholders is around employer/organizational capacity. So the ability to negotiate accommodations really varied depending on the organization's administrative resources, their financial resources, and also the level of awareness and understanding about accommodation and work disability. Some disability management professionals reported that at times, not always, smaller companies may, lack all the resources to formally guide and implement accommodations, very effectively. And as described by Elizabeth, who is an occupational health and safety nurse, she describes that, and she says, it can be hard as a manager if the company's resources around supporting workers is limited. So she says, if you're a manager and you don't know how to accommodate, or even what your responsibilities are, or if you don't have additional supports within the organization, that can make it very difficult. Okay, so that comes to the end of my findings. I'll just briefly end off. So with the first paper, we really tried to provide some transparency to what's occurring as employees with mental illness are negotiating workplace accommodations by describing, how that process unfolds. And, the negotiation does unfold as a process that is nonlinear, that's flexible, that's political, and that's also a social and relational process. So while many workplaces might mandate in their policies for an overarching kind of linear formal negotiation process, and while it may seem like something that is a concrete step-by-step thing, which is what I thought it would be initially before I started this research, the data actually shows that in reality, the process is a combination. It's a mix of formal and informal micro-processes. The negotiation process can be complex. There are tensions there around accessing supports, political hierarchies, and seniority and work culture. So really briefly going into future directions of research, one potential future direction that I think is important is, because some of the disability management professionals I spoke with and some of the workers I spoke with did really talk about how in their experience, smaller companies might at times have more limited resources to support and accommodate workers. That's really important. It could leave employees at those smaller organizations a bit more vulnerable. So I think it would be valuable to explore how those smaller companies are doing. there are some great tools right now, as I talked about earlier, that are accessible and available, but how are they being implemented in smaller companies, and also in what ways are smaller companies succeeding in supporting workers with mental health conditions? Where are they really winning? And also what are some of the challenges? What do employers and workers really need, and what can be done to address those barriers? And that concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Sabrina, for providing your findings for us on accommodation in the workplace for people with mental illness. I think these findings are really timely, given the political climate that we are in now, with changes to support for people with mental illness and the numbers that we anticipate seeing increased in the workplace. So accommodation is really an important topic. So thank you for providing us that your data. I am going to go straight to the questions now. We have some. I want to remind people, though, that we do have half an hour. So if anybody has any questions at all that they would like to ask, please write them in the Q&A and we will get to them. So Margaret says, great presentation, Sabrina. Did your research cover informal as well as formal accommodations? And if yes, what difference did you find in negotiating each?
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you. That's a really good question. So yes, my research did cover and explore informal and formal accommodation practices. In my actual paper, I outlined them and define concretely what they are. So just briefly, formal accommodations, I'm talking about what arose from my data. Formal accommodations came up as, a more written contractual kind of agreement with a set timeline, usually, set dates, kind of set out responsibilities. Whereas informal accommodations were described by these stakeholders and also the workers as more conversational, a bit more casual, more about just developing a good understanding, or if the worker had a good understanding with their manager, they would informally agree that they will have a flexible schedule for however long that worker was in therapy, or that's just a brief example. So what was more interesting than identifying what formal and informal accommodations were from the research, what I found interesting is that the risks and benefits that different stakeholders discussed. So informal accommodations, many of the stakeholders actually were a bit wary of them, and they kind of said, we don't really advise to do this because if you don't have something on paper, something that's documented, organizational structure changes all the time. Just because a worker has an agreement with their manager and it was never known or written anywhere else, and let's say the manager gets let go or moves somewhere else, and then there's a new manager, and the new manager is saying, wait, why is this person getting XYZ, this isn't working. So that can be really distressing and displacing. So there are definitely risks and benefits associated with each. But as I said, the data did show that it was flexible, and some larger organizations I found were a bit more open to being flexible and said, if it's something that is going to take up a lot of time and will require a lot of planning, we will make it formal. And if it's just a really small thing, then we're okay if the manager negotiates it informally. So it varied.
Okay, thank you, Sabrina. Did your participants, another question, did your participants work mostly at large organizations? And how would your findings translate to small employers? So I guess that's an A and B.
Okay, so that's a good question. I would say that yes, the organizations were definitely more mid to large organizations, for sure. What I would say is that I don't want to make the assumption that all smaller organizations are really struggling and they don't have any resources. I don't think that's true, and that would be a really hasty generalization, especially considering it's not something I've explored in detail. However, we did have one outlier organization that was quite a small firm. However, it was a very well-established firm. So the resources they had to accommodate and support all employees was really good. And the worker that was there actually had a really positive experience, because not only like was she at this really well-established small workplace, but she was also like a very highly senior employee. So I will say that the size of the organization, it's important. As I said, I think we should explore it further, but it's not the be-all end-all. It is not the only factor that impacts access and ease of negotiating accommodations. And Margaret, with regards to the kinds of organizations, I really wish I could have had a demographic table, but there was just no room. So I had really a good variety of workplaces. I had some disability management firms. I had an aviation company, an academic institution, a mental health hospital, and a couple of others. So a good variety of mid to large sized organizations.
Okay, thank you, Sabrina. It's always interesting to see those demographics. So brilliant, it says, Margaret, your presentation really shows a complex negotiating accommodations can be. Not simply a process of ask and you will receive, as may be assumed in disability management. So thanks for opening up that discussion. When do you think your paper 1 and 2 will be coming out and have been submitted?
If only I knew, Pam. I mean, Margaret. So, well, I haven't submitted them yet to the department, and I actually don't have a defense date yet, but we are hoping to, that I will defend in June, and then hopefully submit some journals. So for my paper 1, which I took a really kind of main disability management perspective, I'm hoping to submit it to the International Journal of Disability Management. And paper 2 potentially to work, and maybe at another rehab journal. So we're not sure yet. But Margaret, I'll be in touch and I'll let you know once they're out.
Wonderful, thank you. Sabrina, before we go, we have 2 more questions. Before we go there, do you have a contact page on your presentation?
I do, with my email address at the very end.
That would be, yeah, if you could leave that up for people that may be interested in contacting you about your research, that would be wonderful.
Sure, I will go into that right now.
Thank you so much. So let me get to the next question. Andrea says, thanks, Sabrina. For people with insurance claims, can you describe how actors from the insurance system help facilitate the accommodation process? Do they help educate managers or employers about mental illness and how to accommodate them?
Okay, so Andrea, that's a really good question. So the majority of the disability management stakeholders that I spoke to were more like third-party organizations that the employer would actually hire to bring in, right? So when I think about disability claims professionals, I think about them, well, first of all, it depends on the kind of claim it is as well. If it is work disability, obviously that's a little bit different. And in that situation, actors such as return to work coordinators or disability case managers can come in and directly, work with the employee. And the role that I think they have is usually when the employee has been off work, so that they might have gone off work due to various disabilities or injuries. And in this context, if they've gone off work due to a mental health condition and they're trying to come back, it's about negotiating and implementing a great plan to bring them back to work gradually and, ensure that they are supported into coming back into their role. So again, it's definitely a very interactive process, because that disability case manager will be working with the employee, they'll be working with a person's manager, they will be interacting with their health providers who are providing information about the employee's medical restrictions and limitations, proof of what they can and cannot do in their work role. And then it becomes about determining if there's still a job fit. So does the worker's restrictions and limitations and their abilities match with their current job? And if yes, then okay, let's go one way, kind of like a choose your own adventure, if you will. So if yes, then we'll go one way. If no, and there is not a fit, what can we do? Can we come up with a modified position? Is that possible? Or can we do some kind of transferable skills analysis and see if there's a better role that's a fit? So those are some of the roles that I think a disability case manager from like a claims insurance perspective would be doing.
Okay.
Answer your question? I have no idea.
If it hasn't, Andrea, please feel free to type in the Q&A. If not, we will assume it answered your question. I love the choose your own adventure idea. I think it's really catchy. So you might want to, tuck that away and use it somewhere. Really, really kind of vivid way of describing that. So Andrea has another question. Oh, and yes, you did answer her question, so thank you.
Great, thank you.
Did increased burden on coworkers ever come up? What sort of things did you find about this?
That's a good question, and yes, it did come up. So I felt so blessed to have like a lot of really, really rich data that not all of it was specifically related to the negotiation process, so I couldn't add it in there, but yes, this definitely came up. And the way that it came up is in two ways. First of all, stakeholders and workers themselves reported that if they worked in an environment where A, their coworkers did not know that they had a mental health condition that they needed support for, or B, the coworkers were just really, really not supportive, that was very difficult for them in terms of even being motivated to request accommodations or even go through a negotiation plan while hiding it from their coworkers. So that's the first way it came up. And the second way it came up is from the perspective of stakeholders, who then said that the role of coworkers is significant in the negotiation processes. Coworker support was found to be really important, and there's literature that reflects that as well. If your coworkers are nurturing and they're supportive, either as a worker is going through this negotiation process, having these meetings and discussions, or if they're trying to return to work, their support is actually found to be really integral. And when the coworkers are not supportive or they're toxic in any way, that has the opposite effect, and it can be quite distressing for employees as they go through this already kind of distressing process. So yes, it definitely came up.
And Sabrina, on the topic of social or support from coworkers, so social capital, let's say, that was part of your second paper, correct?
Yes, it was. It was.
And how does that dovetail into the findings from your second paper?
So social capital, when I think of social capital, I mean the capital that you accumulate in the workplace in your work role. And that means your reputation as a worker to your superiors, your reputation just generally in the workplace to your coworkers, how well liked you are you reputable as a good performer? What is your job status? Are you permanent full-time employee? Are you a more temporary, precarious employee? Have you had behavioral issues more recently or in the past? How do you recover from that? So social capital is really a multi-dimensional thing. Now, being well-liked within your workplace does play into it. So, something that really came up that was so interesting from the second paper is that having coworkers and other workplace actors to vouch for a worker while they were struggling in their work role or while they needed to negotiate accommodations, one worker used this term, having people go to bat for you was found as really, really helpful and really empowering, and could also, be just generally really helpful. So coworker likability, if you call it that, or workplace reputation was found as important. However, I definitely don't think it's black and white, or that it's the be all end all, and that if you have a slightly abrasive relationship with some of your coworkers, that means you will never be supported in the workplace. It's a lot more complex than that.
Right. So your findings on social capital actually are a great segue for the next question, because as we were going through, you had your first paper, you had mentioned that accommodation is easier if and I'm paraphrasing, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but that accommodation is more likely to happen and be facilitated if the supervisor sees the employee as a good return on investment. Can you, and that, I found that really interesting. Can you expand on that?
Yes. So that finding came, it was very very implicit, like undercurrent, if you will. And it came from like multiple workers shared that with me. And so when I said that, what I mean is, and it came up in the data, there were some really good quotes on this where workers and some stakeholders explained to me that an accommodation is, you know, a resource that an organization is using, is expending. And so organizations, and I'm again paraphrasing, but this came from a somewhat like a participant telling me this, you know, accommodations are resources. Organizations want to know that they will get a good return on investment. So, you know, why would they invest that in someone who's on a 6-month contract and is off work for 6 weeks, you know? No, they would prefer to invest that in a full-time, reliable employee. So for workers who felt confident and they knew that my position is secure, I'm a good worker, I have a good reputation here, I'm established, you know, for me, it's okay. Like I can ask for what I need, I can discuss, I can collaborate. However, for workers who are in a more precarious position, or they had felt they had a previous performance issue or a not so good relationship with their manager, they're the ones that really were more sensitive to, well, why would I ask for this thing when, you know, why would they give it to me? You know, I'm a precarious employee. I know, and I've seen in my workplace that these resources are given to the employees that are quote unquote more valued. And this really speaks to an organizational justice perspective, because what was interesting is that none of the stakeholders I spoke with would really openly say that, yes, we only value this kind of employee versus another. No one would ever say that, you know, it's unethical, but it was there. It was in the undercurrent, if that makes sense. It was quite implicit.
Mm-hmm. All right. Fascinating. I wonder then, it leads me to question whether you found in your data that workers with mental illness were seen as risky investments, or does social capital, a good social capital, trump that?
Oh, bless you, Pam, for asking this question. I love to talk about it. So that's such an interesting question. So Pam, the literature does reflect, and in my research, it was definitely reflected that there is a difference between the understanding and accommodation and the practices and just the ease and clarity of accommodating a physical disability versus a mental health condition, okay? Because, you know, the course and outlook of a physical disability might be a bit more concrete and clear, whereas mental illnesses can often be episodic, they're intermittent, they're a lot more ambiguous. So stakeholders have reported in the literature that they find it a lot more ambiguous to accommodate a mental health condition. And I definitely found that reflected in the data. However, Pam, I will say that there was one of the clear limitations of my research here is that there was definitely a selection bias, because I want to say 99% of these stakeholders I spoke with were very much strong advocates for mental health and wellness. So they came from that perspective of really identifying as advocates for employees with a mental illness. And so there was definitely a bit of bias in the people that I spoke with, because they're all really advocates of, no, we shouldn't have that disparity. And as that quote I showed, you know, why is it we don't have a problem with a broken leg, but why is it that with a quote unquote broken mind there is such an issue? It shouldn't be that way. Asking a question about social capital. So something that came up in my paper is my second paper that I didn't get to talk about, is that social capital is important and it's complex, but it's only one piece of that negotiation puzzle. It's only one piece of the process. And so just because an employee is well liked and has a great reputation and great performance, you know, one of my key findings was that those things don't negate or erase if that employee all of a sudden has a really serious performance issue or does something unethical or really unacceptable in the workplace. Like it's important, but you need social capital, but it's not all you need.
Right. So it's one of the factors that are important, but it wouldn't be the most important factor. Is it fair to say that? What you found?
Yeah, so I think it's important. And what I did for my second paper was I talked a lot about the micro processes and tensions that arise in the negotiation process in this bigger paper. And my second paper really brought a magnifying glass right onto social capital as a process and what it is and what happens. And so I think it's important, but it's, as I said, it's not all you need.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you. There's not a lot of evidence around social capital in the workplace for people with mental illness. So I'm very intrigued. So I wanted to go back to Margaret, who has a question. She would like to know if she could share your slides with her colleagues and team members.
Yes, Margaret, that would be lovely. I have your email, so I can share it with you. Okay.
So she will let you know then, Margaret, when those papers are available. And you also have her email up on the screen should you want to connect with Sabrina directly. So we have approximately 7 minutes left. And so I wanted to act like I was on your committee and ask you some questions that you might be asked on the day of your defense, if that's okay.
Yes, that would be wonderful.
So I want to go to the methodology section then to do that.
Okay.
And I really, I understand that this is a social process that you're looking at and why you chose the grounded theory. That makes sense, and it suits, I think, the research question. But is there another methodology that you could have used? And if so, what is it?
Okay, so this is a really good question, Pam. Thank you. I will say that my first paper, it is definitely a combination between a descriptive study that uses grounded theory strategies for the data collection and analysis. So you can say it's sort of a combination of two approaches. However, when I first started off, I came to my supervisor with this idea, I actually proposed that I use a phenomenological approach. And the reason I did that was because my aim initially was phenomenology for me is really about sharing the lived experience as a story. So for me, from my understanding of the approach at that time, that's what I had wanted to do. I wanted to really share the workers' experiences of how they went through this process and really tell the story of what happens, what they found helpful and positive, and what they really struggled with. So initially, I was going to use a phenomenological approach. However, then I realized that to bring a lot more richness to my findings and really capture the negotiation process effectively, I had to speak with people from other perspectives, meaning stakeholders in the workplace, to really give multiple perspectives. So then when you add that perspective in, the perspective of stakeholders, then it becomes about a back and forth, right? An interaction. And so at that point, the phenomenological approach didn't necessarily make the best sense. And that was when we discussed grounded theory, which, as you said, fits the question a bit better.
Right. Thank you for explaining that. I think you did a great job explaining that.
Thank you.
I have one more question that sort of jumped out at me during your methodology, and that was you bracketed the criteria, the selection criteria for workers who were 18 to 60. It's I'm curious why you chose that range.
This is kind of embarrassing, but no particular reason. I think it was just what my supervisor and I had talked about, and we just kept it at that and didn't really think about it too much. But I had some, but you know what? I had some older workers, like in their 50s, and they were the ones that were more senior, like quite well established. So I'm really glad that I was able to capture that perspective, actually.
Mm-hmm.
What do you
Yeah,
think about that age range?
right. Yeah, it's very important,
Oh,
I think, to
God.
look
I
at
don't
older
know.
workers, and they often get left out when we're looking at that evidence. So thank you. I think you did a great job. And I have no doubt that you will be very successful in your defense. And I wish you all the best of luck and good energy to you for that.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
There is one more comment in the chat.
Okay.
And Margaret, and actually, I wanted to ask you this before the webinar started, and I forgot. So thank you, Margaret, for jogging my memory. What's next for you after graduation?
Well, I will be applying for jobs and also crying while I do so. I'm joking. I'm hoping to work. Ideally, I would love to work in like a workplace, accommodation specialist type of role. Eventually, I would love to do that. I don't know if I will get there right away, but that is really my goal right now. But right after I graduate, I will probably go back to working at the insurance clinic that I was at before, continue working there while I apply for other jobs that are a bit more relevant, which for me is in workplace wellness, employee wellness, accommodations. So that's really where I have my eye on the prize. So if anyone has any advice for me, I need it, and I would love to hear from you and talk.
Well, I will be happy to share my tips with you offline, Sabrina.
Great.
And I want to thank everybody for attending today and helping Sabrina prepare for her defense. Thank you, Sabrina, for taking the time in what's a very hectic period of your life, just wrapping up loose ends and getting ready for defense. So I really appreciate that you took this time to share your findings with us. Thank you so much, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening and providing great feedback and questions. Thank you so much.